There are space programs that fail spectacularly. Explosions, debris, live images that burn themselves into your memory, and there are programs that fail quietly. Starliner belongs to the second category. That's exactly why we need to talk about it now. Because while SpaceX is landing rockets, testing Starship, and routinely bringing astronauts to the International Space Station with Dragon, there is a spacecraft that is officially considered operational. But neither National Aeronautics and Space Administration nor its own astronauts really trust it. Starliner. And what has become apparent in recent months around Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams shows this very clearly. The problem was never just the technology. The problem was a system that no longer works this way. Two capsules, two worlds. To understand Starliner, you have to compare it with Dragon, not emotionally, but structurally. Both programs come from National Aeronautics and Space Administration's Commercial Crew Program. Both were supposed to fulfill the same goal, bringing American astronauts to the International Space Station with American spacecraft. The mission was clearly defined: a pad abort test, a launch abort test, an uncrewed orbital mission, a crewed demonstration mission, and then the transition to operational service with 6 regular crew flights to the International Space Station each. Both companies received billions for this. And yet, the starting situation could hardly have been more different. The United States Congress originally didn't want to approve this program because SpaceX was the only bidder. Not a single one of the established aerospace companies was willing to agree to a fixed price contract. It was only when Boeing joined in that the budget was approved. The expectation was clear: Boeing would deliver and SpaceX would overextend itself. The reality turned out to be exactly the opposite. While SpaceX treated Dragon like an iterative software project, testing, flying, failing, improving, Starliner was run like a classic Boeing program. Long development cycles, paper reviews, little real flight experience, maximum risk aversion. SpaceX sought intensive support from National Aeronautics and Space Administration early on and worked transparently, while Boeing withdrew, worked in isolation, and largely rejected external help. We can see the result today. Dragon is operational, flexible, highly redundant, docks autonomously, can be flown manually, and now even performs orbital corrections for the International Space Station. Starliner can do all that too, at least on paper. But in practice, it has lost something that is priceless in spaceflight: trust. This loss of trust is not abstract. Boeing has now invested over $2 billion United States dollars of its own capital into this program, in addition to the funds already paid out by National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a fixed-price contract that suddenly became very real. If Starliner had been under a traditional cost-plus contract, the taxpayer would have picked up the bill, but as it is, Boeing was left with it. Maybe that also explains why they didn't want this program in the first place. Now let's take a look at what problems they've had with their capsule and what issues they still have. Let's get back to Starliner, the long road to the first crew. Starliner was delayed from the very beginning. Valve problems, software errors, failed unmanned tests, helium leaks, and every single one of these problems wasn't solved in flight, but rather on the drawing board. The unmanned test flight, orbital flight test, one in 2019, completely missed the International Space Station, not because of an exotic hardware defect, but because of a simple timing error. The capsule's internal clock assumed the wrong mission phase. For the software, Starliner was at a completely different point in the flight profile. The thrusters then tried with all their might to bring the capsule to a place where, according to the schedule, it should have been. The fuel ran out before the error could be corrected. Communication issues also slowed ground control intervention. OFD-2 in 2022 once again showed problems with the attitude control thrusters. Not new, not surprising, but a direct continuation of the unresolved issues from the first test flight. And yet they kept going, not because everything was fine, but because they needed to. Because without Starliner, National Aeronautics and Space Administration would officially have only one American crew system left, and redundancy is not an option for National Aeronautics and Space Administration, it's a fundamental principle. However, the problems with the engines were not fundamentally solved. Instead, a years-long dispute developed with the supplier Aerojet rocket. In the end, the design remained largely unchanged. The protective measure for sensitive components consisted of covering nozzle openings during storage. In the humid environment of Cape Canaveral, this proved to be insufficient. The result became apparent later during the flight. The main winners during this phase were the law firms, the flight that almost ended everything. When Starliner launched in June 2024 with Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, everything went according to plan at first. The launch of the Atlas V was precise, the systems remained stable. From the crew's perspective, the spacecraft felt excellent. Wilmore later described the handling as one of the best he had ever experienced in a spacecraft, but this calm did not last long. During the approach to the International Space Station, 4 of the 28 attitude control thrusters failed, not randomly distributed, but in a configuration that affected several degrees of freedom at once. The automatic system couldn't maintain the attitude, so Wilmore took over manually. Several flight rules had already been violated at this point. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a clear abort, but this is exactly where the situation became extraordinary. The question was no longer whether Starliner could dock safely. The question was whether Starliner could return safely to Earth at all. Additionally, during this phase, several helium leaks occurred, affecting 5 different locations. A subtle but serious indication that the propulsion section was not under control. The crew faced 2 options: a risky docking, which in the worst case could have endangered the International Space Station crew as well, or an immediate return flight with uncertain chances of success. Outwardly, this approach seemed like a minor technical glitch, but internally, one flight rule after another was being reassessed. In the end, they chose to dock not because everything was under control, but because it was the least risky remaining option. Why didn't National Aeronautics and Space Administration use the capsule anymore? After this flight, it was clear that Starliner had failed its trial. Not officially, not publicly, but internally. National Aeronautics and Space Administration made the decision not to bring Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams back to Earth with Starliner. Not for political reasons, not because of media pressure, but because trust in the system was no longer there. However, this decision was not communicated immediately. For months, the situation remained unclear. It was only after the United States presidential elections were over that it became public that the return of the 2 astronauts would take place with a Dragon capsule. An earlier retrieval was technically possible. At the same time, Wilmore and Williams were fully integrated on the International Space Station and worked regularly as part of the expedition. In fact, however, it was clear that no one would voluntarily get back into that capsule. Dragon brought both of them safely back to Earth after 9 months. Routine, without drama, just the way manned spaceflight should work. No unique selling point anymore. That brings us to the core problem. Starliner originally had 2 tasks: providing redundancy to Dragon and the ability to boost the International Space Station's orbit. But this unique feature no longer exists. Dragon can now transport astronauts, dock both autonomously and manually, deliver and return cargo to and from the International Space Station, and boost the space station. Starliner can theoretically do that as well. However, in practice, it is not operational. And yet, National Aeronautics and Space Administration will do everything it can to keep this system going. Not out of conviction, but out of necessity, because Boeing has contractual obligations and redundancy remains a central safety principle. If Dragon were ever grounded, National Aeronautics and Space Administration would once again be left without independent access to the International Space Station, a scenario that they want to avoid at all costs. Conclusion: no future for this program. Starliner is not a technical disaster, it's something much more problematic. A political spacecraft born out of the desire for competition, trapped in outdated industrial structures, and kept alive by the fear of having no alternatives. That's why National Aeronautics and Space Administration has ordered another test mission. It's supposed to take place this year, but this fear is losing its significance. Dragon flies reliably and routinely without making headlines. Starliner will remain for now as a backup, as insurance, but backup systems that you don't want to use have a limited shelf life in space travel. At the latest, with the planned decommissioning of the International Space Station by the end of this decade, this program could quietly disappear. Not with a bang, not with an explosion, but with an internal memo. And that's the real tragedy. If you enjoyed this behind-the-scenes look at manned spaceflight, subscribe to Mars Chronicles and give a thumbs up. Thanks to all channel members and Patreon supporters. For early access to our videos, see the info below in the video description. I'm Serwan and this was Mars Chronicles. Thanks for watching. Per spera ad astra. Yeah, then let's do it like this here. Let's show it off.